Good afternoon, everyone, and as much those in the room, and it's wonderful to have a live audience for the second of our in-person events that's also going out live to, we hope, lots of people, and since it's going to be recorded, there'll be many others who will be catching up at a later moment. We have audiences across the world, and they will view at different times. It's an enormous pleasure for me. I'm Fiona McIntosh. I'm director of the APGRD, who's hosting this event. It's an enormous pleasure to have our two guests today who are going to speak to you about perhaps one of the real gems or the only gem of our period of acute isolation during the pandemic, and especially acutely felt, obviously, in the creative industries. They're going to talk to us today about 15 Heroines, that was the brainchild of quite an extraordinary theatre called the Jermyn Street Theatre, which Tom Littler, one of our guests today, is the artistic director. And I have to say, I am pretty sure, but Tom may correct us, that one of the reasons why Jermyn Street Theatre won Fringe Theatre of 2021 was because of the extraordinary creative work they did during lockdown, of which I think 15 Heroines was a centrepiece. It did win, I believe, Omcom Award also 2021 as well. I'm sure both Tom and Indra will talk about it. Just a few more things to say by way of introduction about Tom. Tom is artistic director, as I say, of Jermyn Street Theatre. He was also one of the directors of what was a truly collaborative production that was 15 Heroines. He directed one part, and he will talk about that part, no doubt, in some detail. And since Tom has a dramaturgical background as well, I'm sure he'll want to talk to us in quite a lot of detail about how this production was put together, how indeed it was scripted. And commissions were made as well. Our second guest, and we are really honoured to have Indra Ove, who many of us who are in the UK or in the Anglophone world will be very familiar or struck immediately by Indra, because of course we've seen Indra in multiple shows over many years, and so she is extremely well known, both in the theatre, but particularly, I think, on screen, on television, and in feature films. And in the recent production, this extraordinary 15 Heroines, Indra took the part of Deianira, and I hope we're going to get a reprise of that at some point today. Now, I'm going to disappear, and the whole event then is going to be co-hosted by Tom and Indra, and that includes the questions. And we are sorry that those of you who are watching remotely can't actually ask questions, but I'm sure if you have pressing questions, you could send them to the APGRD, and we will feed them to our guest today. And also, one other thing that our technical team has asked us to let you know if you're watching remotely, and that is, at the moment, you may see us on screen, we hope, but also there'll be a blank half of the screen, which is for the screen behind me, where you will be seeing clips later. But apparently, if you click on the screen where the people are, you will be able to get only the people on screen until the moment when the clips will be shown. So I hope that's clear, and I hope it works. So I'm going to leave the floor now to Tom and to Indra, and thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you for inviting us to come and talk today. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should also preface all of this by saying that early next year, I think the Open Access journal Practitioners' Voices in Classical Reception will publish a long-form piece by me, which covers some of the same ground that I'm talking about today. So I'm not directly quoting from that article at any point, but my talk today does sort of lean into that work a little bit. I'm going to talk as briefly as I can, although I make no promises because there's a lot to say about this this project, and I'm going to intersperse that and liven myself up with contributions from Indra and some playing of the clips from the films that we made. So just briefly to introduce this, and assuming no knowledge necessarily of the prime source of this project. This was a dramatization for the theatre of the 15 of its Heroides. That is the single Heroides. I'm deeply interested in the double Heroides, but we're going to set them aside. And these are the women of classical mythology writing letters to their departed menfolk and complaining, loaded and marvellously complex word, of their abandoned states. And in 2020, Jermyn Street Theatre, which, as Fiona says, I'm artistic director of, we commissioned 15 female or non-binary writers to create new versions of these letters for the stage, and they were then filmed in collaboration with Digital Theatre, who were what's wonderfully called a capture partner. That's a thing. On the project, and they were filmed in the empty Jermyn Street Theatre, and they were broadcast in November 2020. And a quick plug: they are published by the wonderful Nick Hand Books, leading play publisher, so they're all available. And if you can persuade your institution to have a subscription to Digital Theatre Plus, which is the education wing of Digital Theatre, they are there for the next 10 years, so they are available to be seen. As Fiona says, I directed or co-directed 6 out of these 15 plays. Not in fact one whole part, but interspersed throughout the 15. And the others were directed by the brilliant Adjoa Ando and Kat Roby. And then they were all camera directed by Anka Ludica for Digital Theatre. Declare an academic interest in this subject, which has been kind of rumbling away for me for a very long time. When I was an undergraduate here in Oxford, I wrote my I read English, but I wrote my undergraduate dissertation under the supervision of Richard Jenkins at LMH about the trope of the abandoned woman on the beach, yelling after her departed lover. So in some sense, this is the longest, latest and most expensive essay ever written. And nowadays I continue to lead an academic double life. I'm a supervisor at Clare College in Cambridge, and I'm writing a very slow part-time, is it a book, is it a PhD, nobody knows, but about the love letter in the 18th century, and that thinks quite widely about the Heroides and the reception of the Heroides in the 18th century as an influence on what love letters look like. As part of that work, I think about a volume published in 1680, which is a multi-authored translation of the Heroides, which is published in English as the Epistles, published by the Jacob Tonson kind of mega publishing house, loosely convened by the poet laureate John Dryden. And it has pretty much a different, rather starry author for each of the letters. So if they'd got their copyright sorted, and if copyright stretched that far back, we should probably be paying them a royalty. There is some apology due to Tonson and Dryden and those people. So that's the kind of intellectual background, I guess, for this project. It began, as many a good project does, as a failed pitch to the BBC. they were running a commissioning round called Culture in Quarantine, which was about putting live art on screen in the middle of the first lockdown. And at that time, I mean, this was right in the heart of the first lockdown where you couldn't leave your home. We said, what if we commissioned different writers, and then they were filmed in people's homes, down webcams, on camera phones, basically self-tapes, which is also how all actors at that time were auditioning, and that would form the substance of the project. The BBC said no, but by that point we were quite excited about it, and Digital Theatre said yes, and they came on board with the idea of filming it. And then we found some funding, and then a bit more funding, and by June or July we began commissioning these 15 writers. We wanted the 15 to be as diverse in every sense as possible, but particularly in terms of the contrast of their voices, to create a project that, unlike the Dryden Thompson one, which is quite univocal, it tends to sort of cluster around how much like Dryden can I sound is the basic mission in that one. This was always about how different can we make this across 15. Yes, of course, some things are going to keep coming up, but how wide can we make the tonal palette? And that gave us a wonderfully broad range of writers. Many of whom, of course, had no knowledge of Ovid or the Heroides or classical traditions or myths. Some of them deeply interested in those things, 2 or 3 classicists among the 15. By and large, coming to these stories quite fresh, coming to them by means of a sort of commissioning document where I wrote little summaries of each one, probably containing multiple errors because I was in quite a hurry, and then they took those little summaries and then they could read existing translations. But also, and I think this is really important to hang on to, they also then went and looked at other versions of those myths, and they started Googling and they started researching in other ways. Some writers in that early stage were quite resistant to the idea of joining this project. Lots of brilliant, pioneering women writers there who said, well, I've spent my entire career trying to get away from dead white men. This feels like a backward step. And all I could say to them was well, then say so in your play. And we might come shortly to some of the ways in which they said so. And that their kind of looseness and bagginess of the project offered an opportunity not dutifully to follow in Ovid's footsteps, but also to give him a kick where necessary. And perhaps it is. By August, we had first drafts coming in. By September, we were rewriting and we were casting, and we were phoning Indra's agent, and she was saying more money, and we were saying no, less. By late October, we were filming. I mean, I'm saying this because the speed of this is really very unusual in any art form. It was really made kind of to the moment. There were 75 freelancers involved in that project, but in each rehearsal room there were typically 3 people present, a director, a stage manager, an actor, and even when we were filming, there was a cap on the number of people who could be in the room. Film union regulations said that we could only have 12 people in the small Jermyn Street theatre. Theatre union regulations allowed for 15 because the virus famously travels that little bit more violently and virulently when it's film people.
When it's filmed.
Yeah, that's well-known science. So we had 12 people in the room. It was a kind of a wonderfully together project, but also a lonely project in which the actors never met each other because everything was rehearsed in isolation to reduce all the risks. The writers were never in the room. So we sent them little tapes of, here's what we've done, I hope you like it, or nothing, and they just had to trust us. So it was a very unusual process in many ways, and it was broadcast in November, just as that second lockdown hit. I'm sure that helped in terms of securing lots of viewings of it across the world because everybody was at home. And it was helped with a very starry cast and a very starry roster of writers. But I'd also suggest that there's something about the subject matter and the ways in which it was being told by the people involved that somehow captured the imagination of a really broad audience of people that went far beyond an audience of classicists or people who knew anything about these stories before. And here we are, and they can still be read, and they can still be seen. It did strike me arriving in Oxford today, and I'm constitutionally unable, as any ex-Oxford resident is, to go to Oxford without going to Blackwell's. And when I went there, I just noticed that the window display and the displayed books, the huge numbers of those books at the moment that are about race or gender or classical reception. And the intersection of those three things feels particularly dynamic and interesting at the moment. And it feels like this project somehow was able to speak to all three of those areas. Going to show a clip from the very beginning of The Labyrinth. We separated these 15 plays into three sets of five. These are my groupings. They don't need to be done like this. If anyone could ever get the rights to do all 15 again, good luck. But if they did, they could rearrange them. They could do them in a totally different way. You could do it as an all-day trauma fest, I don't know. But they don't have to be done in this way. But The Labyrinth was kind of grouped around Theseus and Jason. Let's have a look at just this beginning.
Sound. Everyone's at speed. Stand by.
Thank you. I guess why dwell on that kind of paratext, if we can call it that, of the film, is because I think we're wearing our kind of cinematic and theatrical hybridity on our sleeve. that little bit of sound that you hear at the beginning, where you hear Carlos, our director of photography, saying camera 1 at speed, camera 2 at speed, everyone's at speed, okay, was caught purely by accident. That was never scripted, but I heard it on a cut of one of the tapes and went, well, there's our opening, and it was the opening to all 3 films. And it kind of suggested the sort of liveness of it, but also the filmed nature of it. And then that kind of background information was subject to a lot of discussion. How much is the kind of bare minimum that people are going to need to appreciate these stories without it becoming a kind of documentary? And how do we keep it almost as blank as possible? And where is the positioning of Ovid within this? Because the longer I've spent with this project, on the Nick Hern books it says, and this was their insistence, 15 monologues adapted from Ovid. On our marketing, we called it 15 plays inspired by Ovid. And these little tussles about where Ovid is, I think, really interesting. And we wanted to make the point that within all of that, that this is a work of Ovidian reception in some sense. I mean, he's certainly there. I mean, he's certainly the kind of climbing frame on which everything is being hung. But these writers are also reaching back past Ovid to older sources, sideways, out to other and later receptions, getting their information from all kinds of places, and that there's nothing apologetic or dutiful about this take. And some of those writers were really very keen to respond to Ovid and write back to Ovid. So I would love Indra to read for us the end of Abby Zakarian's play, which she called Perfect Myth Allegory, 3 lines, which was about Briseis, where Abby really went down a very interesting, robust route. So, Indra, I'm going to get out of your way.
This is the one where I leave again, alive, intact, with money. Security I made for myself. This is the one where I leave a trace that is not greying on a slab, or slick with my own blood, or even just disappeared halfway through, not even a footnote in a story full of swollen dicks. Yes, in the greatest oral tradition, I tell you my story, up to this moment. But it will continue, I promise. This is the one I put down in words, in rude health, entirely sane. This is the one where I stoke the cannon, light the fuse, where my aim is... Well, the joy is not knowing. Rather, the joy is being free to wander into a history I alone will make.
Terrific. Another playwright who very much took on the Ovid challenge was Samantha Ellis. Samantha was charged with doing a version of Phyllis, who one of the lesser known people, I think, probably within these 15. It was her lot to be abandoned by Theseus' son, Demophon, like father, like son, history of fecklessness in the Theseus family. And Phyllis, who's been turned into a tree, kind of really reflects on who's had the chance to tell her story.
I should have told my story to everyone I met. I should have painted it on the walls and shouted it from the rooftops. I should have written it down before anyone else did, before any mended. Ovid. He called me a heroine, but he made me sound miserable. And everyone praised him for writing the woman's point of view, giving it a voice, making our stories heard, centering our pain. You do have to ask, why did he write so many women? Why were all the women abandoned, or pining, or wounded, or raped? Why did he write so many rapes? I know why he told my story. He thought he was cleverer than me. He said, Phyllis would have survived if she'd had me as a teacher. Her teacher. Chaucer put me in the legend of good women. I've got no interest in being a good woman. He said the only man Phyllis could trust in love is me. Ovid wanted to teach me. Chaucer wanted to fuck me.
Great. Thank you. I guess the other thing worth acknowledging within those titles and within the bits that Indra's thinking about as well is that when we say in those titles that we just showed, the stories come from all over the Middle East, they come from Africa, etc. That was, I don't mind confessing, I suppose, a deliberate nipping in the bud of any sort of reactionary reactions that said, these should all be white, or, these are Italian stories, wanted to go right from the get-go before you come at us with any of that. They're not. A, anyone has the right to tell whatever, but B, the stories themselves are international, and this kind of, you all know about this, but it's a less well-known thing, I think, outside classics. There is still that kind of whiteness myth that clings to classics, and so we wanted to get that very clear from the word go. Let's continue with the labyrinth for a moment and see. This is Patsy Ferran, who is about to come in, being Ariadne.
Are you friends? Are you foes? Are you gods? You're here to observe me. I understand. I will try to inform. I don't know this country. Naxos, apparently, I've zero data on its people and animalia, so a stable boy at our palace taught me this when I was 9. It's called whipping. He was whipped in quite the other sense of the word, and he's teaching me this meaning of whipping. This gives me grip. If whatever animal comes at me, I can carry a ball of string. Because one never knows when someone you've trusted utterly and loved more deeply than the wine dark sea is going to slither off like a jackal, leaving one post-coital sleeping while he boards a ship and fucking fucks off, marooning you in an utterly strange and unknown, alien, friendless territory. This is the very ball of string I gave Theseus to navigate in and out of the labyrinth. It was by our bed when I woke, neatly rewound. Look. He was very good with his hands.
Great. Let's stop there. The reason I picked that section is I think it illustrates a number of things about the whole wide project. The kind of the search for relatability, I suppose, within the costuming, within the wheelie suitcase, within the who hasn't been dumped in some humiliating situation at some point in your life. Nearly always sort of with public transport involved, you know. The sort of surprise of the audience there that Bryony writes in. And what I call in 15 Heroines the pronoun question. Not the main pronoun question in the air at the moment, but the one of, is Theseus he or you? And the monologues divide pretty much equally. About half of them adopt a kind of epistolary pronoun and go, you this, you that, you bastard, you left, you must stay, I never want to see you again. The other half go, I'm going to talk to you, the audience, and tell you about him, the hero, the Theseus. And for Ariadne, she says, oh, you're here to observe me. Okay, well then fine. I will try to inform. So that's the contract. But that contract is made and remade differently throughout 15 Heroines. And that, I think, is part of the really interesting shift from the epistolary mode to the dramatic, is that when you enter the dramatic, you have to remake that contract with the audience. When you read a letter, if you're a letter reader and it's not to you, well, you're fundamentally a voyeur, aren't you? You're peeping into a relationship between two people. You might enter imaginatively into the role of the recipient. You might think, oh gosh, you know, he's being accused of something that I did once, so I'm momentarily going to be the recipient. But essentially, you get to duck out, and that's part of why letters are compelling. You know, but in a monologue, you can really be you can be implicated. And that's something that a number of the plays really explored and a number of the productions really explored. For Oenone, for example, the first wife of Paris, who then goes on to marry Helen of Sparta or Troy, this is a play called The Cost of Red Wine, which was written by Letty Precious. Letty's a non-binary black playwright who sees in Oenone's story one about colorism and one about gender relations that feels particular to them. Indra, could you read us just the very beginning of Oenone?
Are all men like this? Are you all thieves of hearts and monsters who crush them, savages put on the earth to make a mockery of love? Tell me, Paris, don't look away. I want to see your eyes. Please. What is it about her that's so different from me? So enticing. Her bed cannot be warmer than mine, surely. Her arms? Her meals cannot dance better on your palate or mix well with the red wine you love so, red wine rich with flavours and history. Or have you changed that too? Of course you have. You now drink white wine, don't you? You drink her. I hope you know her grapes and spices will not leave you drunk with a passion as deep as mine.
Great, thank you. I'd love to have a look at how that piece was filmed in a very different performance, and very differently filmed from the last film that we saw as well. So this is Anne Ogbamo you're about to see playing Oenone, and directed by Adjoa Andoh.
Are all men like this? You all savages put on this earth to shatter hearts and make a mockery of love. Tell me, Paris. Don't look away. I want to see your eyes. Please. What does she have that's so different from me? So enticing. Her bed cannot be warmer than mine, surely. Her arms, meals cannot dance better on your palate or mix well with that red wine you love so. Red wine rich with flavours and history. Or have you changed that too? Of course you have. You now drink white wine. You drink her. I hope you know her grapes and spices will not leave you drunk with a passion as deep as ours.
One of the differences that you can see play out across the films is that in the 6 directed by Adjoa Andoh, she grouped her cameras very, very tightly. It's a 4-camera shoot, which is small for a film, decent for a small theatre. In the ones directed by me and Kat, we're really trying to capture the sense of a theatrical performance. In the ones directed by Adjoa, they're often on a very tight angle. And I think one of the things that achieves is that the audience is kind of profoundly implicated in the sense of sometimes being the you of the original letter. You can see that again in Hermione, for example, a very political piece written by Sabrina Mahfouz, where the audience becomes the police officer who is interrogating Hermione within that piece. I'd like to finish by thinking about humour and about wit. One of the things that people enjoyed, I think, about the films was the laughter, was the cheekiness of them. And sometimes that derives from anachronism, whether that's the wheelie suitcase or whether it's something that we're about to see in Hercules becoming a star footballer, But also I'd like to suggest that those anachronisms are also Ovidian in nature. I think it's a sort of continuation in some sense of an Ovidian joke. not least in his endowing all of these sort of Bronze Age mythological people with what were to him extremely modern, flashy rhetorical devices and writing. In the 18th century, there's a real worry about this. Dryden gets terribly worried in his preface to the epistles that sometimes these women are witty out of season, he says. Stuart Gillespie writes really brilliantly about this, but i.e. they're suffering too much to make jokes this good, and Ovid is not serving them well by making them funny at these moments of tragic suffering. And so there's this 18th century urge to sort of smooth it over, quieten down the wit of it, and give them their sort of dignity and sort of somber tone. I think 15 Heroines uses humour a bit differently from Ovid. It never, I don't think, even in a very cheeky piece like Laodamia, Our Private Love Island, even in a cheeky piece like this, it never laughs at the women. It laughs outward at men or at the patriarchy, or even at itself, even at the construct of what are we doing here? Where is Odysseus anyway? Oh my gosh, he's on a work bonding exercise that has gone horribly wrong, says Hannah Khalil. So let's finish, I think, with Indra reading the opening of the piece that she performs. So this is Deianira, in a play called The Striker by April de Angelis.
It's a bit early for Retsina. I don't normally touch a corkscrew till after breakfast. But today's a special day. Will you join me? Stuffed olive. These grow on the fragrant slopes of Mykonos, the love island. The chili oil gives them a bit of a bite. I've got something I want to share with you. I'm happy for you to take note. Oh, record it on your phones, probably best. What does the world know about Hercules Neville, my husband? His massive dong and his famous left foot, both world-class scorers. But my beef is this. Why wasn't he satisfied with the Ballon d'Or? 101 man of the matches, and me waiting at home on our circular bed with Lindt chocolate smeared on my nipples. I mean, I'm on the keto diet, I can't eat it. How much more can you ask of a wife? Faithful? I watched every match, hand in mouth, gnawing my nails down to the quick, and they were acrylic. Would he be wounded? Would he pull off the classic Cruyff turn, the Maradona scissor, or the Beckham bend? Once, when he executed a goal that laughed in the face of physics, I screamed so loud I set off my neighbour's car alarm and shattered the priceless Laquique standing peacock. Omens. You were always away on tour, lapping up your hot stone massage and more in your 5-star hotels, while I languished home alone with an 8-button jacuzzi, the crystal flutes, and the set of gold-plated love eggs. On return, you were more like a guest than a husband. Whispers of gossip got back to me, poisoning my atmosphere like second-hand smoke. In my despair, I almost gave up hot yoga. Let myself go. But I'm a fighter. which, in case you didn't know, you're about to find out. Okay, well, you went through your teammates' wags like a starving dog overdosing on pedigree chum when you could have had Wagyu steak followed by tiramisu at home. I could stomach that. They were passing shags in the night, discarded like the crumpled condoms you see lying outside the 24/7 Tesco Metro after a night on the lash. Forgotten spurts of passion I could live with. They were on the job description. Footballer's wife. A curse a day. You assigned to Strictly. I watched her pout at you in the Paso Doble, tease you in the tango, press against you in the wanton waltz, your eyes turn into liquid pools of love. Those proud footballing feet that once kicked out fiercely in battle, now transmogrified to tame beasts, gently pattering after her dainty form. The judges, fools, looked on, smiled, bewitched, scored you tens. The world fell in love with you all over again as you fell for her. Headlines in the Daily Mail. Hercules wins the greatest task of all.
Thank you. So much more to say about these projects, but let's stop there on that high point, and I'd love to hear your questions, if there are any. Yes.
Can I start by asking you, Indra?
Yes.
What did this project mean, especially for you, but also from those who acted in it?
Oh, wow. It meant such a lot to us. It came at such an extraordinary time. We'd all suffered that first lockdown. We were suffering that first lockdown. As an actor, it was a terrifying time because the theatres were going. I literally thought I may never go on another theatre stage again. At that point, it was really, really frightening. Our government seemed to have forgotten about the arts, and it was really frightening. That first 6 months, I didn't work a single day because the arts shut down, as we know. So it was a very worrying, unusual, frightening time. And out of that came this incredible invitation to suddenly work on text in this whole new way that we were invited. I got a call saying, do you want to come and do this piece? It's going to be in a theatre, filmed, on Zoom, live. It was a concept we had we hadn't come to terms with yet. It was so brand new. So that was extremely exciting. It was exciting to make contact with creative people again, to have a creative conversation. And then came the text, which was just extraordinary. And at a time where we were also, it's very, it's so interesting what you're saying here today. We were all hyper aware of, Black Lives Matter were at its highest point. The Me Too movement was singing out. We were all hyper-aware. We were all being incredibly reflective and becoming aware of ourselves in this world and what we liked, what we didn't like, what we were going to stand for. So we were all in this kind of heightened state. And in came this incredible text. I was directed by Adjoa Andu, who is an amazing actor-director who I've worked with the year before at the Globe, inviting me to play how do I say her name?
Go with Dianera.
Dianera.
We'll go with
Dianera. To play her. Now, I, like many of these people you spoke about, I'd never read the 15 letters. I was completely unaware of them. And so the whole thing was absolutely thrilling and terrifying at the same time. We went to rehearsal. We had a space. Where did we rehearse? We were at the. We were in town, weren't we?
I can't remember where
Gosh, we were opposite the old Young Vic.
Okay.
In a little place. But, you know, we had to meet outside in Mars. We were all terrified of going anywhere near each other. To come back into the rehearsal room was extraordinary. You know, we were all keeping very, very far apart, not really knowing how this worked. But then being gifted the opportunity to speak these words and unravel them was absolutely thrilling. And to work on this text of these. Well, you know, mine was a footballer's wife. So I was taking, you know, a classic piece of text and now translating it to a footballer's wife married to this incredible footballer. So that was you know, all of those contradictions were thrilling and exciting. And as an actor, that's so juicy to get your hands into, you know, hands and teeth into. And she's got such great attitude. You know, she's what's so great about all these women is they've got such balls, literally, you know, and speaking out, and speaking their minds, and the wit. I think the wit is genius, actually, even in these moments of tragedy and whatever they're going through. The fact that they're that sharp and witty. It's just thrilling. It's thrilling as a performer, it's thrilling as a woman to be able to speak these words and to be able to do these solo pieces, but joined. I mean, that was a kind of extraordinary thing that we, you know, I was asking to be doing monologue, but I knew I was part of a much bigger thing. And that felt exciting. Even though we didn't all meet each other, you could feel the power of us as a group of women being able to execute these brilliant texts written by these brilliant... I mean, Tom managed to get some incredible writers and incredible performers and incredible directors. So we were at the top of our game. And everyone was being asked to stretch their imagination and think beyond any norms or what had come before. And I think that was what was really thrilling, to really rediscover these women, these characters, and put them into these different places. As I say, I'm a footballer's wife, you know, and that's so great for your imagination, for your creativity. So for me, it was a really exceptional, really enjoyable experience. And when they were shown, the feedback and the kind of hunger for them was extraordinary. And you really felt the sense, the lack of creativity out there and the need of that. And, you know, we showed it once and then it came back, didn't it? Yeah. There was a demand for it. There was a real need and demand for it. And I think for what you did, Tom, by having it, you know, against gender, against I get all those things. I think it really fell into what we needed as a society. I think it tapped into that, and it was thrilling to be part of that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask from a sort of directing standpoint, and I guess Andrew, you probably have quite a lot of experience in terms of juggling between theatre and screen and etc. But obviously things are starting to kind of go back to being live and, well, a lot of time hopefully also broadcast. And I know the transition between, as like someone who primarily works in the theatre, going from that everything is always live to, okay, we're working with screens now, must have been quite tricky. And what has it been like sort of emerging the other side of that transition? And is there anything that you particularly picked up on from that period that now you're going to carry through in your practice?